1971's Look at Yourself is arguably Uriah Heep's finest album. Let's get into it. Welcome classic rock fans to another episode of Classic Album Review, and today we're going to discuss Uriah Heep's Look at Yourself, with its pulsating Hammond sound, nuanced guitar phrasing and theatrical vocalizations of David Byron. For me, his voice epitomises the theatre and melodrama of this much underrated band. A melodrama, of course, befitting of the great Charles Dickens novel from which this band derived their name. Uriah Heep, of course, is the unctuous villain in David Copperfield, who's constantly proclaiming in hand-wringing supplication that he's ever so humble. But this album is anything but cowed and humble. It announces itself in this melange of sound, with the aforementioned Hammond, of course, pulsing away like a nuclear reactor at the very heart of this band. Of course, the 1970s saw the flourishing of progressive rock born from the ashes of psychedelia, the avant-garde, and progressive pop experimentation, and ultimately it becomes a melting pot of styles, with its lyrical content often drawn from navel-gazing meditations, mythological themes and beasties, to even looking at some sci-fi explorations. And Uriah Heep at this juncture were one of those bands that were looking to explore different textures and tones in their music, from the shifting rhythms, the wonderful melodies, it has to be said, and those pirouetting vocals which no doubt paved the way for bands like The Sweet and Queen to employ so exquisitely a bit later on. David Byron was often compared to Ian Gillan. In fact, Uriah Heep were often compared to Deep Purple due to their heavy Hammond-infused sound. I think it's fair to say that this band were one of those bands that were existed in the shadows of bands like Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin, and eclipsed by Pink Floyd, no pun intended. And, you know, I generally feel Byron was a much underappreciated vocalist. And July Morning showcases his remarkable vocal range, from those low murmurings to the wails of a man who just sat on his own testicles. It has to be said that David Byron's vocal style and delivery is a real highlight for me on those early Uriah Heep albums. It's dynamic and almost vaudevillian in its theatricality. As I said at the very beginning of this video, I consider this album to be a landmark of 1970s rock. It's a perfect example of progressive and experimental rock, influenced, of course, very much by those pop and rock sensibilities of the 1960s, as of course were Deep Purple, which draws a line between them and the more overtly progressive rock bands whose influences were drawn from jazz and the European romantic classical tradition. A fact that irked Lester Bangs, who believed that rock and roll should constantly be reverential to the paradigms of American black music. But Uriah Heep operate more within the parameters of rock and blues, and progressive perhaps with a small p. One can detect the paraptic wailing of Robert Plant and Ian Gillan, as well as that heavy Hammond-infused sound of Vanilla Fudge, which is definitely an influence on this band.
How big an influence were bands like Vanilla Fudge and The Nice, you know, when you were starting out?
Vanilla Fudge was the reason we got the Hammond organ. Right. With Mark Stone. Yeah, oh, definitely. I was a big Fudge fan.
They very much set a standard for non-mainstream, uncommercialised rock for the remainder of the 1970s, and it has to be said that this band's a big break was when they get to support Three Dog Night, I think on a US tour, ultimately exposing them to quite large audiences. Of course, this album epitomises that very hard rock sound that would come to define Uriah Heep, of course, led by the wonderful guitarist slash organist slash vocalist Ken Hensley, and the wonderful guitar musings of Mick Box. In fact, their debut album, Very Heavy, Very Humble, is seen for many as being a very early heavy metal classic. In fact, some put it right up there with Deep Purple's In Rock. For me, Look at Yourself is a transitional album before we get the wonderful Demons and Wizards, which sees the band drifting towards more fantasy-themed fare. Stuff that would no doubt go on to influence bands like Iron Maiden and Dream Theater. It certainly puts forward the idea that Uriah Heep were at the forefront, perhaps, of the progressive metal genre. This album was released on the Bronze label after the band had departed the Vertigo label, of course, those wonderful Vertigo Swirl albums. When they released Look at Yourself, it was their second album of 1971. Their sophomore release, Salisbury, had come out the same year. Also, Mick Box is a wonderful guitarist, a very underrated guitar player in my opinion, whose interesting guitar phrasing is very much at the heart of this band's sound. And Ken Hensley was also a massive contributor to the overall sound of this band. He was a great singer as well. He wasn't quite up there with Byron, of course, but nevertheless, his voice combined with Byron's leads to some very interesting vocal harmonies and textures. Worth noting, of course, that Ken Hensley wrote or co-wrote virtually every song on Look at Yourself.
Because I am not a trained musician. I would call myself first and foremost a songwriter, and then everything else comes after that.
And one has to mention the rhythm section at this period as well. The rhythm section comprised of Ian Clarke on drums and Paul Newton on bass guitar. And this was the last album, I think, that would feature both of them together. In fact, I think Newton's galloping bass lines would no doubt go on to influence Steve Harris. And what is also interesting about David Byron's vocal side is not those falsetto flourishes, but the way he enunciates. Every word is crisp and clear. There's no doubt his voice is astonishing and multi-octave, from the balladic harmonies achieved on July Morning to the pitch on a song like Bird of Prey, for example. I know it's not on this one, of course. The tonal qualities of that voice are nuanced and exquisite, from the low-end crooning to the more operatic reachings. And when his voice combines with Hensley and other band members, we get some wonderful, sublime, multi-layered harmonies. I think it's fair to say that their first album lacked maturity. I think that's a fair criticism. But their second embodied a spirit of sonic experimentation. Many argue that Salisbury is their most progressive album. But Look at Yourself was the album for Uriah Heep that really defines them, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of the sound that still endures to this day. This band certainly never got the acclaim they deserved. They certainly weren't particularly popular in the mainstream music press, but arguably all the best bands never were. But there's no doubt Look at Yourself pointed the band in a new direction. As Mick Box says of that album, Look at Yourself was the platform for demons and wizards to happen, and I'm proud of it. After that point, our lyrical content went towards swords and sorcery, which captured people's imaginations. Look at Yourself contains some exquisite moments of progness. And while it's true that feisty, guitar-driven rock sound very much sets the tone for this album, it's the band's two most progressive moments that really shine through on this one. For example, the sublime July Morning and the heavier Shadows of Grief, of course, which some have maintained represents the lengthy excursions into the almost psychedelic space rock forum. I'm not so sure about that one, though. But certainly the textures explored in this album fluctuate between the raucous and the subtle. This album is dominated by that very heavy guitar sound, of course, and lots of organ bombast, which is just can't get enough of that. And the title track starts by very much laying down a marker which differentiates this album from the more proggy, whimsical elements of their previous album. The title track is quite a bludgeoning number, with the guitar and organ getting faster and heavier before it descends into that percussive melee at the end. The next track on the album, I Want to Be Free, displays the band's hard rock dynamics, of course. We're mixing heavier rock with softer passages. This track very much is a showcase for Byron's close harmony vocals and immense guitar chords from Mick Box. But It's July Morning is a song that everyone wants to talk about. I love the way it spins off from that keyboard motif before the guitar comes in. It reminds me very much of Joe Cocker's reworking of the Beatles' Get By With Little Help From My Friends. But it's the silent passages in this song that are very much part of the composition, which beautifully allow Byron's plangent vocals to breathe. It's a song that started off as an acoustic ballad, but the final version is symphonic in its ambition. About 7 minutes 30, and you get the wonderful Mini Moog synthesizer played by Manfred Mann. The track starts off slow and seductive, with Byron exquisitely exploring the space between the verses and the chorus, before it explodes into an organ and guitar trade-off that make up the last 4 minutes of this track. This track was actually inspiration for a Bulgarian event called Jelaya, I think I pronounced that right, where participants gather on the Black Sea coast on the 1st of July to watch the sun rise over the waters. It's a mesmerising exploration of dramatic emotions, made even more intense by the band's playing, of course. And reference has to be made to the Moog synthesizer that comes in at the end, perfectly complemented by the organ and guitar structures beneath it. As I've said, Hensley has been rather sniffy about Manfred Mann's contributions to this track. In fact, he says, if I may quote, "Mann's Moog lines were just a non-important noodling exercise that went against my better judgment. And fans certainly don't miss it when Uriah Heep play this tune live. Tears in My Eyes stands out for me for its very interesting guitar sound, from the wah-wah to the slide guitar, which reminds me of Jethro Tull's Song for Jeffrey. It's a song that certainly moves the band up a gear, with Hensley, I think, taking lead vocals on this one. There was some, of course, it's brilliantly compromised by Mick Box's metal riffage, but it's that slide guitar sound which some critics have suggested makes it sound rather Allman-esque. Shadows of Grief is another great one, of course, with its haunting organ moves. It's a very dark piece of music, almost 9 minutes in length. It's, as I've said before, it's considered one of the more proggy elements on this record. And the listener is taken on a rollercoaster ride of exploration of very negative emotions and female treachery. Hensley's organ work is absolutely brilliant and complemented, of course, by a very doom-laden sound overall. The interplay of the organ and the guitar in this is absolutely fabulous, and goes very much to defining the overall sound of this record. In fact, one critic has described this track as psychedelic pseudo-metal. What Should Be Done is an interesting number. Of course, it's certainly not my favourite song on this album. It just kind of feels a little bit out of place for me. There's lots of very interesting musical interaction and strong riffing, but for me it's a song that's very much defined by Byron's ethereal vocals. And of course the piano is reminiscent of Traffic's Feeling Alright. And of course it ends with Love Machine, which is just a fine, heavy number. There's no doubt about it that Look at Yourself is an example of well-crafted 1970s hard rock, with some prog flourishes as well. The album of choice, perhaps, for those that didn't really appreciate the meandering nature of its predecessor. One thing we can agree on, of course, is it seems that 1971 was where the band's musical mojo was fully fueled. 2 great albums in 1 year is no small task. But for me, Look at Yourself is important because it perfectly bridges that gap between psychedelic leftovers and that future heavy metal sound. When we think about that as a burgeoning genre, often we quite rightly talk about Black Sabbath and Deep Purple, but I think this band deserves a mention as well. Anyway, you've been watching the episode of Classic Album Review. Please do click like, subscribe and check that bell so you get notified of any future uploads. And if you enjoy my musings on music, please do check out the links below for ways you can support me and my channel. So it just leaves me to say, as always, thank you for watching, do stay safe, but more importantly, please do keep listening.